Imagine this: Christmas, 1914. The first winter of the Great War. Millions of men are dug into miles of muddy, freezing trenches across Europe, from the North Sea to the Swiss border. This is the Western Front, a landscape of death and despair. For months, they've been locked in a brutal stalemate. A cycle of shelling, machine gun fire, and futile charges into no man's land. The initial belief that the war would be over by Christmas has evaporated, replaced by a grim reality of attrition. Morale is at rock bottom. Soldiers are exhausted, homesick, and disillusioned, living in conditions that are almost indescribable. Then something extraordinary happened. It wasn't ordered by generals or negotiated by politicians. It started small, spontaneously, in scattered pockets along the front lines. On Christmas Eve, in the Ypres salient in Belgium, German soldiers began to do something unthinkable. They placed small Christmas trees, or Tannenbaums, along the parapets of their trenches, lit with candles. Then they started to sing. Across the shattered landscape of no man's land, the sound of Still Nod, Silent Night, drifted towards the British lines. At first, the British soldiers were suspicious. Was it a trick? A prelude to an attack? But then tentatively they responded. A British rifleman might shout a Christmas greeting across the darkness. A platoon might start singing their own carols in reply. The first Noel met O Tannenbaum, a strange, beautiful, and utterly surreal concert performed by men who, just hours before, were trying to kill each other. This musical exchange grew into something bolder. Shouts of "Merry Christmas, Tommy" were answered with "Merry Christmas, Fritz." Signs were held up written on scraps of wood or cardboard. "You know fight, we know fight." And then the bravest of them took the next step. A German soldier, perhaps unarmed, would cautiously climb out of his trench and walk into the dangerous corpse-strewn space between the lines. A British or French soldier, seeing this, would do the same. They met in the middle. What followed was one of the most remarkable and human moments in the history of warfare. Enemies shook hands, exchanged gifts, small tokens of home. A German might offer cigars or a button from his tunic. A Brit might give a tin of plum pudding or some cigarettes. They shared photographs of their families, realizing the man on the other side was not a monster, but a husband, a son, a father, just like them. They spoke in broken English and German, using gestures and shared laughter to communicate. In some sectors, the truce became even more organized. They agreed to bury their dead. For days, the bodies of fallen comrades had lain in no man's land, impossible to retrieve under the constant sniper fire. Now, in a joint effort, British and German soldiers worked side by side, digging graves and holding shared burial services, reciting the 23rd Psalm together. It was a moment of common decency and shared grief that transcended national enmity. The most famous image from the Christmas truce, though accounts vary, is of a football match. In several places, a makeshift ball was produced, perhaps a cap stuffed with straw. Or an empty ration to end an impromptu game kicked off in the frozen mud of no man's land. Germans against British, playing for the pure joy of it. It's a powerful symbol. For a few hours, the universal language of sport replaced the language of war. These were not soldiers anymore. They were just young men enjoying a game on Christmas Day. These truces weren't universal. Many parts of the front, the fighting continued with its usual ferocity. Some officers on both sides were horrified by what they saw as a breakdown in military discipline. But where it did happen, it was profound. One British soldier, Bruce Bairnsfather, later wrote, "I wouldn't have missed that unique and strange Christmas Day for anything." He described looking at the German soldiers and thinking, these were the men we had been told were savage barbarians. But this fragile peace couldn't last. The high commands on both sides were furious. They saw fraternization as a direct threat to the fighting spirit of their armies. What if the men simply refused to fight anymore? Orders were issued, threatening severe punishment for any soldier communicating with the enemy. Generals like Sir Horace Smith-Doran, of the British Expeditionary Force, stated that such truces would discourage the offensive spirit in our troops. The war machine could not tolerate peace. By New Year's Day, the truce was largely over. Artillery was ordered to fire on specific targets, deliberately breaking the calm. Snipers were sent back to their posts. The generals made sure the men remembered who the enemy was. The soldiers were rotated to different parts of the line to break up the bonds they had formed. The war machine ground back into motion, and the killing resumed. The Christmas truce of 1914 was never repeated on such a scale. The war became far more brutal. The introduction of poison gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, and the unimaginable slaughter at the Somme and Verdun in 1916, hardened attitudes on both sides. The innocence and faint hope of that first Christmas were gone forever, replaced by years of industrial-scale carnage. So, what is the lesson of this incredible day? It serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, in the midst of the most horrific conflicts, a shared humanity can persist. It shows that the lines drawn by nations and the hatred stirred by propaganda are often fragile. The soldiers in the trenches, when left to their own devices, discovered they had more in common with their enemies than with the distant generals and politicians who had sent them there to die. The Christmas truce was a brief, beautiful flicker of light in the immense darkness of the First World War. It was a day when soldiers refused to be enemies and chose to be human instead. It's a moment in history that asks a haunting question. What if the war had ended right there? What if all along the front, the soldiers had simply put down their guns and walked home? It didn't happen, but for one magical Christmas day, it almost seemed possible. It reminds us that peace is not just the absence of war, but the active presence of understanding, empathy, and a shared humanity. Thank you for watching.